Evening. David, let me start with you. What's your reaction to Boris Johnson calling for a Trump deal rather than the JCPOA?
Well, his comments were pretty remarkable, right? I mean, he called it a Trump deal. Of course, there really isn't a Trump deal. Trump hasn't put forth a specific proposal that would replace the Iran nuclear deal. But you have to give Trump some credit. He seems to be getting what he wanted. After the Iran missile strikes last week, he gave comments from the White House, and he urged the European countries and China and Russia to pull out of the nuclear deal. Now we see that Germany, France, and England are suggesting that they're moving towards pulling out. They're triggering an enforcement mechanism because they're saying Iran is not complying. Of course, Iran says it's not complying because sanctions were put in place by the U.S. that are hurting Iran, and Iran wants the European countries to give them something to offset the economic damage caused by the U.S. sanctions. So that's where we are right now. But to get somewhere productive, Trump really needs to put forth a real plan. Boris Johnson says, let's do it, but what is it?
Well, we'll see. I thought this was interesting. This is President Obama's former national security advisor, General James Jones, talking about the decision to kill Soleimani. Watch this.
What the administration did in the Soleimani case is absolutely correct. I give them credit for doing that, and I think it was the right thing to do. And I think it's, as articulated by the president, it's a potential game changer.
Potential game changer. I mean, obviously, Mark, an entirely new strategy in terms of how to deal with Iran. Do you think our allies will come along with us, as Boris Johnson suggests?
Yeah, first of all, I give the general great credit for saying that. I'd love to see if one of the Democrats on the debate stage tonight is willing to say the same thing, because that's what we should all be saying about that decision. The world is better off without Soleimani in it. Look, the Iranians have miscalculated at every step of the way. If you think about it, as when Trump put on the maximum pressure campaign, their strategic goal was to get the sanctions lifted and separate the United States from its allies. And instead, they've managed to do the exact opposite. The sanctions are getting tighter. They have been blamed for all the escalation because they repeatedly, as you laid out all those attacks at the beginning of this segment, Trump didn't respond to any of them until they crossed his red line and killed an American, and then he took out Soleimani, so they lost their top military and terrorist commander, and then they brought the U.S. and its allies closer together, and in the process have managed to unleash, after shooting down the Ukrainian plane, some of the biggest protests against their regime internally since the 1979 revolution. So Iran has misplayed this. The Trump administration is succeeding in destabilizing the Iranian regime, and it's the world's better off for it.
Yeah, this feels like a real moment, David. You look back at 1979, the fall of the Shah, and the United States, through a number of circumstances, this religious regime took over. You look at 2009 under the Obama administration, another moment in time that a lot of people saw as an opportunity to help nudge and perhaps even, support in some ways the people in order to topple this regime. Do you think that we are at one of those moments again? And do you think that Democrats who have not really been supportive of these protesters should get behind this and perhaps provoke such a change?
I hope you're right that we are at such a moment. I also agree with General Jones about Qasem Soleimani. The world is better off without him. Iran is now engulfed in protests again. So that could move towards a key moment where we move closer to regime change. I do think that Democrats in Congress should be supporting the protesters and the demonstrators, just as President Trump has suggested he does with his tweet in Farsi aimed at those protesters. But Iran can be in protests and it can be suffering from sanctions, but it also proves resilient and resistant to change. And real change is not going to happen without a real opposition that's fortified inside Iran. Remember, Iran has 80 million people. Even if 1 million people are on the street rioting against the country, that doesn't mean they're getting any closer to overthrowing the regime.
In the November protest was that almost every single region of the country did have protests protest going on, which is something that has been very unusual. One of the other things, Mark, that I want to sort of touch on here before we go is the president sort of trying to realign the situation here with Europe, who has more of a relationship with Iran. China also has a very dealable relationship with Iran. Is the president sort of suggesting, look, Europe, let's go back to the old model. Let's all be together in this, and let's support each other and allow sort of isolate China and Russia with regards to Iran?
Well, I think he's letting Europe take the lead, and if they want it, the president has basically said, "Look, I don't care if we get a negotiated deal with the Iranians or not, because the sanctions in and of themselves are in and of themselves because we have starved the regime of the resources that they were giving to Qasem Soleimani to carry out terrorist attacks across the Middle East, to engage in Shia imperialism across the Middle East, and they don't have the money to do that anymore. So just if we just stay there in the status quo, we're fine. If the Europeans want to get a Trump deal, then let them be the intermediary and convince the Iranians to come to the table, and that's perfectly fine too.
But that would entail, I would imagine, David, pulling out of any agreements, any deals, companies that are still doing business with Iran in parts of Europe. That would have to be part of that deal, I would imagine. It would be more isolationist of the country than working on any sort of arrangement. At least that's what it looks like.
Well, the three European countries took the first step in their statement today, and they are coming down hard on Iran for not living up to its obligations under the nuclear agreement. But they also were critical of the United States and the fact that the U.S. pulled out of the deal unilaterally. Now, Europe has to probably put sanctions back in place if Iran doesn't respond to this by saying that it is going to go back to limiting its enrichment of uranium and limiting its centrifuges. Let's see what Iran's reaction is.
Interesting moment. Indeed. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Great to see you both tonight. We'll see where our allies go in Europe on all of this.